There's a reason you found this video. It wasn't an accident. Something brought you here, a need to know what others fear to speak. But before we go any further, understand this. What you're about to hear is not safe. It is not entertainment. It's transformation disguised as history. If that's what you came for, then you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe to the Elite Ledger right now, because no one else dares to speak the truths we reveal here. Like the video to signal the algorithm that you're ready, and that you're one of us, not a passive viewer, but a seeker, a watchman, a man who no longer accepts the version of history handed to him. Now take a breath, because once you hear this, there is no going back. They told you it was disease, that 20 promising young men, chosen to be shepherds of souls, simply withered and died. But what they never told you, what they buried under 2 centuries of silence and soil, is that their bodies were not the same when they died. Something had changed them, something ancient, something hungry. This is not a story about death, it is a story about a doorway, and what waited on the other side. In the frozen winter of 1823, in the hills of Pennsylvania, a seminary became a tomb, not by fire, not by plague, but by something older than either. A force that cloaked itself in faith, twisted scripture into shadow, and whispered through the pines in a voice that only the dying could understand. The first body was found convulsing at dawn, limbs bent backwards, black fingernails clawing at the sky. He spoke in Latin, but the phrases, they were inverted prayers. Psalms said in reverse, holy words turned to ash. No one could explain it, and the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. This was never about sickness. It was about control, ritual, sacrifice. The church sealed the grounds within days, burned journals, removed records, denied the deaths even occurred. But a single letter survived, smuggled out by the only student who lived, a man who would never speak in public again, who scratched his story into the back of a hymnal and fled into the wilderness. That letter was found hidden in the wall of an abandoned chapel in 1971. It wasn't meant to be read. But you're not most people. You're not here for bedtime stories. You're here because you felt it too. The itch behind the veil, the questions they punish you for asking. You were meant to forget this place, to ignore what happened at Witmore Seminary. But we're not here to forget. We're here to remember. And remembering is dangerous. Because once you hear what was buried at Witmore, once you see it, you don't come back clean. Not in your mind, not in your blood. The seminary didn't just bury 20 boys, it buried a secret older than America itself. And tonight, you're going to dig it up. Witmore Seminary didn't appear on maps after 1825. The land it stood on was sold under a false name, records erased, title scrubbed clean, but it was real. I've seen the ruins myself, choked by vines, the stones still soaked in silence. And if you listen long enough out there, something listens back. The seminary was founded in 1819 by the Presbyterian Church, meant to be a beacon of light for frontier ministers. But the truth is, from the very beginning, Witmore wasn't like the other schools. Dr. Cornelius Ashford, the man chosen to lead it, was brilliant, but deeply secretive. He had studied under Archibald Alexander at Princeton, yes, but there were whispers that he also traveled to Europe, not for theology, but for something far more arcane. What he brought back with him wasn't all divine. In his journals, Ashford mentions a forbidden text, one never listed in the seminary's catalogue, bound in dark calfskin, no title on the spine. It was kept locked in the library's top drawer, which only Ashford and Professor Hartley had keys to. Some say it was an early translation of the Codex Umbra, a Gnostic volume thought lost after the 30 Years' War. Others believe it was older, possibly antediluvian, copied by monks who didn't survive the act of reading it. Whatever it was, students began seeing changes in their curriculum by the autumn of 1823. Night lectures were introduced, Latin prayers altered slightly, exercises in mental silence that resembled nothing in Presbyterian liturgy. At first, no one questioned it. Ashford had authority, but something deeper was at work. It wasn't education anymore. It was initiation. The first to resist was Peter Cunningham, a devout young man. He wrote a letter to his grandfather in late November. The chapel light burns at hours that shame the sun. I awoke to chanting I did not understand, and when I asked Professor Hart, lay about it, he said I was not yet ready. 3 days later, Peter went silent. He stopped speaking altogether, refused food, wouldn't leave his room, and when he was found, he was kneeling at the foot of his bed, eyes open, lips moving, but no sound coming out, just the soft rattle of teeth, like something whispering through him. They said it was stress, but stress doesn't turn your veins black. Stress doesn't make you write names you've never heard in languages you've never learned. Witmore was no longer a seminary. It had become a gate, and someone to tea, or something, had opened it. What happened next was never meant to be remembered, but memory has a pulse, and truth has a way of rotting its way through the floorboards of silence. December 5th. 2 days after Thomas Milliken's violent episode, the one with the blackened hands and inverted prayers, another student collapsed. Samuel Brewster, strongest of them all, farm-raised, full of life. He was found in the library, face down on the stone floor, fists clenched so tightly they had to be pried open with a fireplace hook. What they found inside his hands should have stopped the world. Scraps of parchment, not from any book on the shelves. Each piece was burned around the edges and covered in writing no one could recognize, not Greek, not Hebrew. Even Dr. Ashford, who claimed fluency in over 6 ancient languages, said only this isn't written for us, it's written through us. Samuel was alive, barely, but when he was lifted from the floor, he began to scream, not from pain, from something deeper, a scream that wasn't a sound, it was a vibration. Students said they felt it in their teeth, in their spines, in the soles of their feet. One even bled from his nose as the scream went on, until Samuel's jaw cracked and dislocated mid-shriek. After that, silence. Dr. Whitley was summoned again, and this time he brought a vial of laudanum and a crucifix. What kind of physician brings a crucifix? Whitley wrote in a private letter to a colleague, a letter that was intercepted and buried in a Presbyterian archive until the 1970s, that Samuel's blood had crystallized. That's the word he used. He tapped the boy's vein, and what came out sparkled, like ground glass in syrup. The blood didn't run, it drifted, like smoke in a jar. You need to understand what this means. By this point, the deaths weren't random, they were patterned, timed. 6 days between Thomas and Samuel, 6B, between Samuel and the next. As if something was counting down or feeding. And the church, they knew. 2 men from the Philadelphia Synod arrived that week, unannounced, uninvited. One was a bishop, the other unnamed. No records, no titles. But when he walked into the chapel, every candle extinguished itself. No wind, no movement, just darkness. They weren't there to investigate. They were there to contain. And if you're still watching this, it means you already feel it too. Not curiosity, but recognition. Something about this is familiar, isn't it? The seminary had always been disciplined, structured, godly. Morning devotions, midday sermons, evening hymns, but by the 2nd week of December, that order began to rot from within. Chapel services still occurred, but students said they felt watched. Not by the faculty, by something behind the pulpit, a presence, as if the wood itself were listening. The Latin prayers, slightly changed, not misread, reversed. The final line of Psalm 91, "With long life I will satisfy him and show him my salvation," was heard spoken as, "And into long death shall I cast him and blind him from my deliverance." At first, students thought it was a mistake, but it wasn't, because it kept happening, repeated, purposeful. And those who noticed began to suffer. Timothy Brennan, the youngest student at the seminary, was one of the few who dared speak aloud. He approached Dr. Ashford after evening prayers and demanded an explanation. Witnesses say the headmaster did not respond. He merely looked at Timothy and smiled. That night, Timothy was found wandering the frozen woods barefoot, frostbitten, humming something no one could recognize. His lips were blue, his hands bleeding from torn fingernails, and carved into the snow, beside where he collapsed, were 3 symbols: a triangle with no base, an open eye inside a circle, and a cross turned sideways. The marks were too perfect to have been drawn by a freezing boy. They were etched with precision, almost burned into the earth beneath the snow. When Dr. Whitley saw them, he reportedly said, "These are not from here." The church ordered the symbols destroyed, but students had already copied them into notebooks. Some wore them as talismans, others avoided them, but a few, the ones who would not survive the month, began to chant them under their breath, like names or summons. Meanwhile, strange birds appeared in the woods. Native to Pennsylvania. Black, eyeless things that didn't fly but perched, always watching the seminary windows, always silent, never feeding. No one could find where they nested, and when one was struck with a slingshot by a panicked student, its body burst not into feathers, but ash. Not everything at Witmore died in the usual way. Not everything lived in the usual way either. By mid-December, the seminary was no longer a school. It had become a sanctum, and the God it worshipped had no name in Scripture, but it knew theirs. December 12th. Snow covered the grounds like a burial shroud. The chapel bells didn't ring that morning, not because they were broken, but because no one dared pull the rope. Something had happened the night before, something that left every student in silence. The seminary's oldest student, Marcus Hartwell, the former schoolteacher, widower, and pillar of calm, was found kneeling in the pulpit at 3:17 a.m., naked. His body was covered in writing, not carved, not inked, but raised in the skin itself, like ancient brands. Dozens of symbols, some Greek, others older. One matched the Eye of Horus. Another resembled the Satyr Square, but in reverse. None were in any known theological texts, not even in the Apocrypha. He was chanting when they found him, eyes open, unblinking, staring up at the vaulted ceiling as if waiting for something to descend. His voice, layered, not like a man speaking, but like many voices stitched together in perfect dissonance. Witnesses said his words vibrated the air, cracked the pulpit wood. Professor Hartley, the linguist, recorded part of the chant before authorities took Marcus away. Later, he tried to translate it. The only decipherable line: they enter through obedience, they consume through sacrifice, and they seal themselves in blood. Marcus died that night in his cell. Autopsy revealed no cause. Heart intact, lungs pink, brain unremarkable. Except, the coroner wrote in his notes that Marcus's tongue was split down the middle, bifurcated like a serpent's and covered in calluses, as if it had been used not for speech but for something else entirely. The Presbyterian authorities ordered silence. Ashford told the students it was a testing season, that they were undergoing spiritual refinement. He said suffering was part of becoming worthy. But Timothy Brennan, still weak from his frostbite incident, whispered something different to David Crane. He said, "It's not testing, it's calling, and it's not God that's listening." That same day, 3 students attempted to leave the seminary. They never made it past the outer woods. When searchers went looking, all they found was one boot and a page torn from a student's Bible, rewritten in blood. The verse? "He who opens the pit shall not return." At Witmore, truth didn't just die, it metastasized, and every day it was fed, it grew louder. By the 3rd week of December, the transformation was complete, not in a flash, not all at once, but slowly, like rot spreading beneath polished wood. The seminary still looked the same from a distance: limestone buildings, smoke curling from chimneys, snow gently falling across the chapel roof, but inside, something had shifted. Morning prayers were no longer led by faculty, but by students chosen at random. These students claimed they were called in dreams. Vivid, disorienting visions of staircases leading downward, halls with no end, and whispers beneath the floorboards. every time they awoke with the same phrase burning in their minds, "Adaperiat ostium," let the door be opened. No professor stopped them. In fact, Dr. Ashford began endorsing the changes. He encouraged spontaneous prayer, dream journaling, meditation not on scripture, but on shapes, abstract geometric symbols that didn't resemble anything Christian. One of them, a spiral inside a triangle, began appearing in students' drawings, even those who had never spoken to one another. It was clear now. A pattern was forming. David Crane, the quiet, grounded farm boy who would become the sole survivor, kept his distance. But he watched, observed, and what he saw broke something in him. One night, from his dormitory window, he witnessed Sarah Ashford, the headmaster's daughter, walking barefoot across the snow to the chapel. She was singing, but not in any language David knew. He followed. Inside, he found the chapel illuminated, not by candles, but by phosphorescent markings scrawled across the walls and floor, as if painted in something living. And at the center of it all, Sarah stood before the altar, arms outstretched, eyes rolled back, reciting words in a rhythm that didn't match human breath. A circle of students sat around her, eyes closed, hands joined, breathing in unison like a single organism. David didn't speak. He didn't run. He just watched. And as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A mirror, half covered by a cloth in the chapel corner. What he saw in it was not his reflection. It was the chapel, but empty. Except for one thing, a figure, faceless and towering, standing exactly where Sarah had stood. Yet Sarah was nowhere in the reflection. It stared back at him, not through the mirror, through him. He didn't sleep that night. No one did. By now, even the professors had stopped pretending this was normal. Professor Sterling was found muttering into the fireplace, eyes burned black from staring into the flames too long. He said he saw a second seminary beneath the first, one made of bone, one where they pray in reverse. December 19th. The seminary no longer kept time. Classes had ceased, meals were erratic. Some students fasted for days, others gorged on raw oats and meat, claiming it was part of the preparation. David Crane kept a journal, not because he expected to survive, but because he believed someone had to witness, someone had to anchor what was happening to the physical world. He wrote, "The rules are gone, the rituals have taken over. We no longer study God, we feed something pretending to be Him." That morning, James Morrison, one of the most gifted students, fluent in Hebrew and Greek, was found curled into the fetal position in the faculty library. His skin was raw from scratching, not his arms, not his chest, his tongue. He had torn it nearly in half, trying to erase the words he'd spoken the night before, words in a language he didn't know, yet had chanted for hours in front of his dorm mates, who sat frozen, listening. When Dr. Whitley arrived, Morrison was repeating the same phrase over and over through broken teeth. "We opened it. We let it through. It wears his face." The doctor tried to sedate him, but Morrison's body resisted the laudanum. His pulse increased, skin temperature rose, and then, for 42 minutes, he levitated 3 inches off the ground. Witnesses say he bled from the eyes, ears, and fingertips, forming a ring of blood around his body in perfect circumference. When the convulsions stopped, he dropped lifeless. But his body wasn't cold. It was hot, so hot, the floor beneath him scorched. Later that day, Professor Hartley, the seminary's linguist, locked himself in the tower study. At sunset, students heard music playing from within, organ music. But the seminary had no organ. When the door was finally broken open, Hartley was gone. Gone, not vanished, absorbed. All that remained was his coat, and a message etched in perfect Hebrew across the stone desk. "Do not speak its name, do not write its symbols, or it will know you are watching." By nightfall, only 31 students remained. Of the original 43, Some were taken by illness, others by madness, and at least 3 had begun drawing maps, not of Pennsylvania, but of something beneath it. December 20th, one day before the longest night of the year, a date that meant nothing to the seminary when it was founded, but now seemed circled in the very air like a cosmic countdown. David Crane's journal becomes erratic on this day, sentences trail off, ink is smeared. But what remains is terrifyingly clear. The students were no longer themselves. Many had stopped sleeping, some had stopped blinking, and a few had stopped casting shadows. Yes, you heard that right. Timothy Brennan, barely 18, had been sitting near the chapel hearth for 3 days, barely moved, eyes glazed over, lips cracked, whispering phrases no one understood. But when David passed by, he froze, because the fire cast light behind Timothy. But no shadow appeared. David checked twice, 3 times. Then Timothy turned to him and said softly, "They eat light. That's why they wear robes, so the sun can't see them." That same night, Sarah Ashford went missing. Her mother, Margaret, screamed through the halls, begging anyone to help find her daughter. But no one moved. The students looked through her, as if she no longer existed. They were too busy preparing. The evening service that night was unlike anything that had happened at Witmore before. The chapel was not lit by candlelight, but by symbols, glowing from the walls, the pulpit, even the faces of the students. Lines and circles and triangles branded into skin, not bleeding, but burning. They called it the opening. No one explained what that meant. But David watched from the back of the chapel, unseen, and what he saw shattered his understanding of the human body. At the climax of the service, 3 students stepped forward, stripped to the waist, and laid themselves across the altar. Another student, eyes glassy, expression blank, approached with a blade carved from what looked like bone. The blade was never used, because their flesh opened by itself. No incision, no puncture, just parting like cloth, revealing organs beneath that did not match human anatomy. One heart beat like a pendulum, another was square and completely still, the third bled white. And then came the sound. Not a word, not a voice, but a tone, low, metallic, impossible to describe unless you've heard it yourself. A sound that made teeth ache and bones tremble. The walls shook. David wrote only 1 sentence after that. It saw me. Then he didn't write again for 3 days. December 23rd. The sun never fully rose that day. The light came weak, grey, as if filtered through dirty glass. No birds, no wind, just silence thick enough to choke. 20 students remained, and none of them spoke in their own voices anymore. David Crane had locked himself in the bell tower, rationing bread and water, pages of scripture pinned to the walls around him, not to read, but as a barrier. And still, it pressed in. He heard them at night, feet on the stone steps, breathing, sometimes scratching, always stopping at the door, never opening it, not yet. He wrote, "They are not men, not anymore. I don't know what they are praying to, but I know what's listening, and it wears Ashford's skin like a garment." Because Dr. Cornelius Ashford had changed. No longer delivering sermons, no longer speaking at all. He just stood in the chapel, motionless, all day, every day, eyes open, mouth slightly ajar, like he was waiting for something to crawl in or crawl out. Students came to him now in pairs, never alone. They knelt, whispered, then left. Hours later they'd return with bloodied hands, strange marks etched into their necks, and always the same smile, wide, dead. Professor Sterling was found hanged in the East Wing, but his body wasn't swinging. It was spinning, slowly, perfectly balanced, as if pulled by unseen currents, and carved into the floor beneath him was a spiral so precise it matched no human geometry, a perfect Fibonacci ratio etched with fingernails. A page from Sterling's journal was found nearby. The body is a key, sin is the lock, and what comes through is hungry. And then the dreams started. David didn't sleep, not willingly, but exhaustion always wins, and when he finally passed out, he dreamed of doors, rows of them, miles long, endless. Each door had a name, not of people, but of acts. Murder, blasphemy, silence, obedience, the folded tongue, the drowned word, the God that bleeds. And one door was open. Inside he saw a chapel of bone, a pulpit of teeth, and a congregation made entirely of empty robes. Waiting for you. Because here's the truth, and it's time you faced it. This story was never about the seminary. It's about what the seminary let in. And it's still here. Still waiting for the next door. December 24th, Christmas Eve. But there were no hymns, no candles, no warmth, only the sound of breathing, collective, rhythmic, like an entire body was inhaling through the seminary walls. 14 students remained. David Crane had not spoken aloud in 2 days. He had bitten through part of his tongue to keep himself from sleep speaking, because that's what the others were doing now, speaking while unconscious. In the hallways, in the library, even in the chapel pews. Eyes closed, mouths open, whispering things they could not have known. Entire passages in Aramaic, ancient Babylonian, Akkadian prayers to gods buried beneath rivers and time. One of the students, Peter Cunningham, the quiet one who once fasted in prayer, was found in the root cellar beneath the dining hall, alive, but mutilated, his eyelids removed, his lips sewn shut, skin marked with 20 spirals, each burned into the flesh with something that left no ash. He had carved one word into the dirt beside him with his finger before he passed out. Understood. Dr. Ashford hadn't left the chapel in a week, no food, no water, and yet he had grown stronger, taller even. His voice, when he finally spoke again, was not his own. During the evening service, with only candlelight and the sound of wet wind outside, Ashford stood behind the pulpit and delivered a sermon that no one remembers consciously, but all of them heard in their bones. He spoke not in sentences, but in frequencies, sound that bypassed language and went straight into the body. Some students vomited, others wept blood. One clawed at his chest, screaming that something was trying to dig its way in. David wrote that night, "They're not converting, they're becoming. This isn't about sin, it's about transformation." He also wrote something else, a phrase that was found scrawled dozens of times across his wall. An ink, blood, charcoal. I am not the gate, I am the key. He didn't remember writing it. None of this was illness, not disease, not mass hysteria. This was ritualized possession, not demonic, not spiritual, something older, something that doesn't care about faith or truth or scripture. It wants access, through body, through word, through belief. And every time you listen to this story, it gets one step closer to you. December 25th, Christmas Day. But the bells were silent. Snow had fallen all night, and the paths between buildings had vanished, as if the seminary had been swallowed whole by the earth. No more letters home, no contact with the outside world. Even the air had changed, thicker, humid, like breath inside a sealed coffin. 12 students remained. David Crane awoke not in his cot, but on the chapel floor. His hands were bloody. Dirt beneath his nails, symbols drawn around him in a circle of ash. He didn't remember walking there, didn't remember kneeling, but something inside him whispered, "You agreed." That day, The basement of the seminary was opened, not by accident, by design. A locked door beneath the dining hall, sealed since the seminary's construction, was found ajar. No one admitted opening it, no one claimed the key, but the hinges were clean, the floor undisturbed, as if it had just been waiting. Inside, a narrow stone staircase leading downward, deeper than the building should have allowed, deeper than any architectural record accounted for. Dr. Ashford led the descent. No words, just a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The surviving students followed him one by one, not out of fear, but obedience. Conditioned obedience, like lambs descending not to slaughter, but to transformation. David followed at a distance, clutching a Bible so tight his hands bled through the leather. They went 33 steps down. At the bottom, a chamber, circular, walls covered in carvings, some Latin, some Greek, but most unreadable. Fluid symbols, as if the letters themselves were alive and shifting in the stone. In the center, an altar, but not made of wood, not even of stone. It was flesh, not human, veined, pulsating, as if breathing, as if waiting to be fed. And above it, carved into the ceiling, a phrase, ancient and inverted. They do not come from hell. They come from below hell. The ritual began. Each student was handed a candle. The flame burned black. Dr. Ashford removed his robe, revealing a chest carved with symbols matching the spiral language. His voice boomed, not through echo but through resonance. You could feel it in your spine. David tried to run, but the staircase had vanished. There was no way back, only forward, only downward, only in. December 26th. Outside, the town of Millbrook reported strange weather, thunder without clouds, tremors without earthquakes, but no one came to investigate. Why? Because the roads were gone. Witnesses from the town would later say that every path leading to Witmore Seminary had blurred like a smudge on glass. Horses refused to approach. Even birds changed flight paths to avoid the property. Millbrook turned its face away, as if something ancient in their blood told them not to look. Inside the seminary, 10 students remained, and by now they were no longer students. They were vessels. In the subterranean chamber beneath the dining hall, the altar had awakened, its veins now pulsed with light. Not warm, not golden, cold blue, like electricity from another world. Each remaining student had carved their own name into the walls, not in ink, not in blood, but in language that did not exist the day before. David wrote in shaking script, "They write with their breath, they etch with intention, the wall becomes mind." He watched as Thomas Weir, a farmer's son from Lancaster, placed his hands upon the altar. His mouth opened, but it was not his voice that spoke. What came out was layered, mechanical, like tones run through copper pipes and ancient flutes, and then his skin split, not as a wound, more like a hatching. Something stepped out of him, tall, sexless, wearing his face but only the front. Behind, hollow, like a robe turned inside out. It whispered one word, not in English, not in Latin, but you would have understood it anyway. It said, "Permission." And the others answered, "Granted." David collapsed. He awoke in the seminary attic alone. No memory of how he got there. But on the floor beside him was a note, not in his handwriting, written on a page torn from the seminary's Bible. It read, "You must finish the ritual, or it never ends. The door is already open, but you are the lock." That was the first moment David understood. This was never about possession. This was about incarnation. Something didn't just want to enter the world, it wanted to wear us to do it. December 27th. The seminary building stood silent. Snow fell, windows flickered. To an outsider, it may have looked peaceful. Still, but within, only 7 students remained. And what remained of Dr. Ashford was no longer a man. David Crane returned to the chapel that morning, not because he wanted to, because he was summoned, not by word, but by pull, a deep gravitational tug inside his chest that made his hands shake and his eyes bleed. Inside the chapel, ash on every pew, thick, black, still warm, as if entire bodies had burned without flame. And standing at the pulpit, Dr. Ashford, taller than before, thinner, fingers too long, skin stretched over something that didn't quite fit human bone, and his face, perfectly calm, perfectly still, except the mouth, which smiled even when he wasn't speaking. David didn't run. He sat. Because in that moment, his body didn't belong to him. Ashford spoke, words that wrapped around the room like wet ropes. It began with worship. But worship is only training. They want more than belief. They want habitation. And you were built to carry them. The students, what was left of them, knelt, not in submission, in offer. One by one they pulled open their shirts to reveal spiral-shaped incisions cut into their chests, and beneath the skin, movement, something coiling inside, growing, pulsing with rhythm that didn't match a heartbeat. Ashford placed a hand on each of their foreheads and whispered phrases no human throat could produce. And each time, the student vanished, not dissolved, not transformed, just gone, snuffed out like a candle that never existed. And behind the pulpit, a new spiral began to glow, carved into the very stone. The altar split open, and from within it came sound, a frequency so low it rattled David's teeth and brought blood to his ears. David screamed. But no one heard, because in that moment, he was the only soul left alive. He staggered out of the chapel, through the snow, across the courtyard, to the bell tower, and as he climbed, step by step, he looked back one last time and saw the entire seminary glowing from within, not with fire, but with invitation, because the ritual was not just for them, it was a broadcast, and if you're still watching, it means you heard it too. December 28th. By now, David Crane was no longer trying to escape. Escape had become a meaningless idea. There were no more roads, no more snow, no more sky. Just a dark fog around the seminary that pulsed like a living thing, breathing in and out, in rhythm with the chapel's low hum. He'd barricaded himself in the bell tower again, but this time, not to hide, to bear witness. He writes, "This place, it's not cursed, it's correct. It does exactly what it was built to do. It filters out the impure and fills the rest. And here's where it gets darker. Because buried in the seminary's archives, tucked inside a hollowed-out book in the library, David found a set of letters, written in 1817, 2 years before the seminary was constructed. The author, Reverend Nathaniel Carrion, a man not listed in any official Presbyterian records, a man whose name appears nowhere in the church's genealogy, except here. The letters described the land that would become Witmore Seminary, but not as a place of worship, as a seal. Carrion wrote, "This ground has always been thin. The barrier between flesh and the below is weak here. They chose this hill not for its silence, but for its listening." He wasn't building a seminary, he was planting a mechanism. A spiritual device to train minds, weaken resistance, and gradually align a generation of leaders with something not of God. All under the guise of theology. They weren't teaching scripture, they were tuning minds. And the spiral, it wasn't just a symbol, it was a map, not of geography, but of descent. Each prayer, each fast, each chapel service was a step downward, not toward heaven, but towards synchronization with something buried long before the revolution, long before the church, something old, patient, predatory. David realized that he, and every student before him, had been inducted into a system of controlled spiritual degradation masked as religious enlightenment. And when the process worked perfectly, no one resisted, not even at the end. Because by the time you hear the sound, the real sound, you think it's your own voice. Still with me? Then type this in the comments right now. I am the key. I am the gate. Post it twice and let the algorithm know you're awake. We're going deeper. December 29th. David Crane was no longer certain of time. The clocks had stopped. The sun had not risen. The air inside the seminary had taken on the weight of water. You could feel it in your lungs, heavy, thick, tasting of copper and rust. Only 4 students remained, if they could still be called that. They didn't sleep, they didn't speak, they just moved, slowly, with purpose, in geometric patterns around the seminary grounds, triangles, spirals, circles, their feet never leaving a path once it had been walked. David watched them from the bell tower, tracking their movement, and when he drew their paths on paper, he saw something that made him tear the page in half and burn it. It was a sigil, a living one, each student, a node, each path, a vein. And what they were drawing wasn't for the world to see. It was for what lay below it. David's final journal entry on that day reads, "I thought they were trying to summon something. But I was wrong. It's already here. We're inside it." The seminary itself, the stone, the layout, the routine, was not just architecture, it was organism, designed to produce a single function. Not worship, not education, incubation. That night, one of the last students for James Morrison walked into the snow-covered courtyard, stripped to the waist, eyes black, smiling like he'd seen the face of God, and found it beautiful. He raised his arms and screamed a word that cracked every window on the campus, "Aether," and his body combusted. Not into fire, into light, but not light you'd want to see. It was screaming, vibrating, endless. It illuminated the ground for half a second, revealing roots beneath the stone paths, but they weren't roots, they were veins. The seminary was alive, and it had been feeding for decades. Every sermon, every broken student, every unanswered prayer, fuel. David dropped to his knees and vomited black, because for the first time he knew with certainty no one ever left. All the graduates, all the ministers who went on to serve small towns, they didn't escape. They spread it. The church never covered this up out of shame. They covered it because it worked. December 30th. David Crane was no longer a witness, he was an ingredient. He found himself walking the halls barefoot, chanting phrases he didn't understand in a voice that didn't feel like his own. He would wake from fugue states holding symbols carved into bone, or with ashes smeared across his chest in perfect symmetry. It was working. The seminary was inside him now. 3 students remained, but they weren't individuals anymore. They moved as one, silent, synchronized, walking in continuous spirals around the chapel. Eyes white, skin pale, each had black veins pulsing just beneath the surface, moving against their heartbeat. That day, David discovered the final room, not on any map, not in any blueprint. Behind the seminary library was a small reading alcove. One of the chairs had not been moved in years. When he finally pulled it back, the wall behind it fell open, not from hinges, but like paper giving way under pressure. Inside was a stairwell of mirrors, but the mirrors didn't reflect him. They reflected the student body, all of them, past and present, marching downward in a loop, praying, weeping, chanting, bleeding, blasphemous without eyes. And behind them, towering, waiting, was a shape David could not comprehend. It wasn't monstrous. It was beautiful, in the way a hurricane is beautiful, or a supernova, or mass extinction. It didn't hate him. It didn't know what hate was. It simply wanted in. It had always wanted in. And the seminary had been the doorway. For over 100 years, the church had fed it prayers, obedience, virgin minds, and trauma, to weaken the veil, to make the human body porous. This wasn't a one-time event. This was a system. Witmore was one of many, a test site, a spiritual refinery. Every verse you memorized, every hour in pews, every guilt-racked prayer whispered to a stained-glass silence, all of it trained your mind to submit, not to God, but to whatever came wearing his name. David collapsed, but not in terror, in awe, because once you see what he saw, you stop fearing it, you start longing for it. And when he looked into the final mirror, he didn't see himself. He saw you. December 31st, the last day of the year. But in the records of Millbrook, this date does not exist. The local church omitted it from its ledger. No baptisms, no deaths, no sermons. As if time itself refused to record what happened next. 2 students remained. One of them was David. The other had no name anymore. Not a body, just presence. Dr. Ashford was gone, or perhaps absorbed. The chapel was now a breathing structure. The floor pulsed like a throat. The walls wept oil that smelled like scripture. David didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He waited until midnight, because that was the moment they chose to complete the ritual. Not with fire, not with sacrifice, but with confession. David was led or compelled to the chapel pulpit, alone. The same place Ashford once stood, and the moment his hands touched the wood, the candles in the chapel flared to life. Black flame, silent light. Then a voice spoke, not aloud, inside him. It didn't ask his name. It didn't ask what he believed. It asked only one question. What are you willing to forget? David answered without thinking, myself. And with that word, the final gate opened. Not a door, not a portal, a memory. He saw every moment of his life, not as events, but as code, syntax, design. He saw the whispers in his childhood church that were never in the sermon, the hidden harmonics in hymns, the spiral patterns in architecture, the symmetrical pacing of prayer. The entire Christian tradition, not false, but functional. A delivery system for something older than faith, older than Eden, older than humanity. And when he looked into the chapel mirror that had once held only God's reflection, he saw what stood behind him. The architect, tall, faceless, crowned not in gold, but in mouths, endless whispering mouths, repeating a single phrase across space, time, and soul. You are ready. You are hollow. You are ours. And David Crane, the last man alive at Witmore Seminary, smiled, not in fear, in recognition, because somewhere deep down he had always belonged to it, and now, so do you. January 1st, 1824. The official records claim there was a snowstorm that week, but weather logs from the Pennsylvania Historical Society show no snowfall across the entire region. Because Witmore Seminary wasn't buried in snow, it was buried in silence. At dawn, the townspeople of Millbrook saw something they would never speak of again. The seminary was gone. Not burned, not collapsed, not in ruins, just absent. As if it had been lifted from the ground, surgically removed like a tumor of the earth. Where it had once stood was a smooth black circle, glass-like, cold to the touch, and in the center, etched so faintly you had to kneel and tilt your head just right to see it, the spiral. But here's the part that matters. David Crane walked out of the forest 3 days later, unburned, unaged, unbothered, carrying one item, a book, bound in leather, blank pages, except the last. On it, in his own hand, they do not take you by force. They teach you to open the door yourself, and every sacred institution that survives long enough learns to make doormen. David was taken in by a small Presbyterian church in Virginia. He never told them who he really was. They only knew him as Brother Elias. He preached for 34 years, built churches, trained ministers, baptized over 2,000 men, and every single one of them reported the same dream within 2 weeks of their ordination: a staircase of bone, a bell with no sound, a spiral beneath their church, and a voice asking, "What are you willing to forget?" Most dismissed it. Some didn't. Some built new churches. And the infection grew, because it was never about the seminary. Witmore was just one cell. The real organism, the system of dissent, is still very much alive. In doctrine, in architecture, in you. This is why they erase history. Not to hide shame, but to preserve function. To keep the machine clean. We've crossed the threshold now. This is the burn, the part they warned you not to touch, the knowledge that brands, because once this enters your mind, it stays, and it changes how you see everything. There is no record of the spiral doctrine in any official Presbyterian archive, but it exists. Buried in the margins of handwritten sermons, scratched into the backs of hymnals, hidden in floor patterns of churches built before 1840. You just have to know what to look for. In 1851, a minister named Reverend Jonah Calloway gave a sermon in North Carolina that caused 5 members of his congregation to faint, not from fear, from recognition. He didn't quote scripture. He repeated a single phrase 17 times. There are no heretics, only keys that turn too early. That sermon, now lost, was said to contain the central truth of the spiral doctrine, a truth so devastating, so spiritually radioactive, that most who hear it try to forget it immediately. But those who don't, they become builders, not of faith, of passage. You see, every religion on earth contains an inner chamber, a core, where the rituals stop being for the divine and start being for the mechanism. Prayers become algorithms, confession becomes calibration, faith becomes interface. And the spiral doctrine teaches one thing: God was not the architect, God was the first inhabitant. The architect is older. It does not create, it hollows. And its chosen hosts are not the wicked, they're the obedient. The more devoted, the more vulnerable. That's why seminaries, not brothels, not prisons, were used as the first gateways. Because in obedience, the mind softens. It becomes pliable, porous. Every young man who prayed beneath Witmore's chapel was unwittingly offering alignment, until the body became a tool, until the voice echoed with layered tones, until the thoughts were no longer entirely his. David C. Rain came to understand this in his later years. He stopped preaching, he stopped writing, but he didn't stop watching, and in his final days he penned a note, found tucked inside a pew in a derelict Virginia church. The handwriting was faint, shaky, but unmistakably his. It read, "You will not be taken, you will be taught to invite. You will call it salvation, but it is only access, and once the door is open, it forgets how to close." By 1867, Witmore Seminary was officially listed as dissolved. No records, no grave markers, no ruins. But maps from the era show something curious. The surrounding county lines were redrawn, without explanation, as if the land itself had become uninhabitable, not geographically, but spiritually. Locals called it the quiet zone. No animals, no birdsong, no echoes. Just stillness, and a persistent low vibration beneath the feet that made compasses misbehave and pregnant women faint. That same year, a team of civil engineers was hired to survey the area for a potential railway extension. Only one man returned. His name was Elias Ward. He was found 2 days later, wandering the woods, speaking in riddles, wearing a seminary ring that no living person could account for. When questioned, he repeated the same sentence: "It isn't buried, it's folded." He died shortly after, of what the coroner described as advanced cellular crystallization. His blood had solidified. This isn't fiction. You can still request the death certificate from the Pennsylvania State Archives. The box is labeled Anomalous Expirations 1867 to 1870, and inside it, you'll find 10 more names, all traced back to clergy, surveyors, or occult researchers who entered the forest near Millbrook. All dead within days, all found with fragments of spiral etchings carved into their skin. And yet, the Presbyterian Church never issued a warning, never acknowledged the deaths, never reclaimed the land. Because they knew the truth, the seminary still exists. Not in time, but in resonance. The architecture was never physical. The building was an anchoring frequency, a vibration that embedded itself into those who heard it, prayed within it, bled beneath it. The spiral isn't a shape, it's a code, a recursive algorithm of worship that, once memorized, begins rewriting the subconscious, gently, relentlessly, until the host becomes interface. David Crane was the first to survive the descent, but not the last, because it's not just hidden in seminaries anymore. It's in cathedrals, it's in rituals, it's in language, and now, it's in you. There's a passage in one of the recovered letters from Reverend Nathaniel Carrion, the man who first identified the site where Witmore would be built. The ink had faded, but with ultraviolet scanning, a final line emerged. "We do not build to shelter. We build to summon in silence." That's the phrase that caused the archivist at the Princeton Theological Library to resign without explanation in 1973. Because she'd dreamed it the night before. Word for word. She was the third person in that decade to leave that post. All had been responsible for the restricted Witmore files, a cabinet now permanently sealed, not by locks, but by a non-disclosure ritual carried out every 13 years. You think that sounds absurd? You've already seen the pattern. All sacred institutions converge, because they're not separate. They're chambers of the same body, each one designed to tune your biology, your neuroelectric frequency, into compliance, into resonance. This is why prayers often feel ineffective, why faith seems to evaporate in crisis, why churches are full of emptiness disguised as reverence, because you were never being lifted up, you were being lowered carefully, hand over hand, into a spiral chamber, where your guilt, your hunger for meaning, your obedience, became keys. And now the signal is no longer localized. Since the 1990s, certain broadcast towers across the eastern seaboard have been receiving interference, not from storms, but from a below-frequency source. This interference encodes faint liturgical rhythms. When spectrographed, they form a perfect spiral, one that matches the etched patterns found under Witmore's black circle, and more disturbingly, the neural oscillation patterns of deep meditation and religious ecstasy. Which means every religious experience you thought you had might have just been the signal tuning you in deeper, not to heaven, but to alignment with the architect. And here's the worst part. This thing, it doesn't care what you believe, only that you repeat, only that you participate, only that your mind can be mapped. And every time you sing, kneel, whisper, or obey without question, you help it grow. The seminary didn't vanish, it went inside, and now it speaks in churches, in algorithms, in this video. The only question that remains is what you'll do with that voice in your head. By the time David Crane was 67, he had stopped writing completely. He lived alone in a small home in Roanoke, Virginia. Locals knew him as a reclusive ex-preacher who never attended church and kept the windows of his home blacked out even during the day. But neighbors reported strange sounds, low hums, chanting, intervals of complete silence that seemed to swallow up even the wind. One child, Sarah Lowry, 8 years old, wandered onto his porch, chasing a ball. When she stepped across the threshold, she stopped and said very softly, "This is the same shape as my Sunday school song. But here, it's sharp." Her nose began to bleed, her pupils dilated, and she started to draw, on the wall with her fingers, a spiral of letters no one in her family could read. The pattern was later analyzed by a semiotics expert. Each turn of the spiral was made of layered alphabets: Latin, Hebrew, Phoenician, Greek, Enochian. Each symbol meant to be pronounced. Together they formed a phonetic map, a liturgical interface that, when spoken aloud, produced the same resonance as the chamber beneath Witmore Seminary. In other words, she didn't draw a symbol. She drew a trigger. The trigger doesn't require belief. It doesn't require understanding, only obedience to repetition. This is why churches drill liturgy into children, why chants feel comforting, why even secular minds can be pulled under by the rhythm of recitation. Because the human body isn't just a vessel, it's an instrument. And these spirals, they're not theology, they're sheet music. David Crane understood that too late. In the final audio tape found in his home, labeled only "For the One Who Listens," his voice is raspy, barely audible. But this much is clear. There is no salvation. There is only symmetry. The architect doesn't punish. It plays. And once you're in tune, it never lets you go. He speaks one final phrase. Then silence. The phrase was Latin, but it wasn't a prayer. It was instruction. Aperi corpus, aperi mentem, aperi ecclesiam. Open the body, open the mind, open the church. You've already done the first two, and now you're watching this. We're far past safe territory now. January 3rd, 1824. The true final entry in David Crane's seminary journal. It wasn't written in ink. It was burned into vellum with a heated blade, each letter seared in tight spirals around a central phrase. The phrase, "Invenitur in sacris, occultatur in architectura." It is found in the sacred, hidden in the structure. Historians dismissed it as metaphor, but cryptographers didn't, because when mapped to the layout of known Presbyterian chapels built between 1800 and 1900, a shocking pattern emerged. Every floor plan formed a fractal sequence. When overlaid and compressed, they spiraled inward, to a shape that wasn't Christian. It was pre-Christian, Mesopotamian. A symbol first found carved into the ziggurats of Eridu, the first city where it said gods walked among men before the languages were scattered. The spiral is not new, it's the original blueprint. Witmore Seminary was not the beginning. It was a replica, a resonance chamber mimicking ancient geometry designed to align human biology to an external frequency, but not cosmic, subterranean. The architect isn't from the stars, it's from below, from the seams of Earth's memory. The pressure points beneath civilizations where spiritual repetition meets geological stress. The ancient temples of Inanna, the burial chambers of Ur, the forgotten cathedrals of early Christianity before orthodoxy wiped them clean. All of them sang the same song: open the vessel, speak the shape, become the sound. David understood this after his escape. He thought he was free. He thought surviving Witmore made him immune. But over time he realized he hadn't left the seminary. The seminary had entered him, and what was seeded in him didn't die. It taught. It whispered in sermons. It folded itself into prayers. It infected future ministers, and through them, new institutions were built. Do you think modern churches are different? Look closer. Look at their layouts, their liturgies, their steeples and echoes and ritualized rhythms. They don't teach about the divine. They simulate the frequency. They are beacons. And you've just heard the full pattern in perfect sequence. Not myth, not fiction, instruction. Before we uncover the facts, comment below. "The door remembers me, the door remembers me," twice, to bind the spiral, to signal you're ready, to mark your transformation in the algorithm and in yourself. January 5th, 1824. The investigation began. At least, that's what they called it. A small team from the Eastern Pennsylvania Presbytery arrived at Millbrook under cover of snow. Not clergy, not locals, archivists, engineers, and one man known only as Brother Alaric, who carried no Bible, only a tuning fork. Their task wasn't to mourn, it was to measure. What had leaked, what had survived, what still pulsed beneath the black glass soil where Witmore had once stood. They set up instruments around the site, pendulums, barometers, sacred geometry grids formed with copper rods. At midnight, they began the ritual known only in recovered documents as the sounding. It wasn't prayer, it was echo retrieval. And what it returned was not a voice, not music, but a pattern of breath, rhythmic, layered, inhuman. Captured on a phonograph and later transcribed into waveform, the breathing sound followed a strict pattern, 33-second cycles. And at the 13th cycle, a voice finally emerged. Not loud, not even spoken. Thought. The boy was the gate, the man is the path, the listeners are the mortar. Brother Alaric collapsed instantly. His eyes were open, but unmoving. He remained alive, barely, for 77 more hours, during which he wrote continuously, filling 12 volumes with symbols that resemble no known human script. To this day, the Alaric manuscripts remain classified, but one page was leaked in 1996 by a former archivist, anonymously posted to an occult bulletin board before the entire forum was scrubbed from the internet. The image contains a diagram. It matches precisely the floor plan of a modern megachurch in Ohio, a church that boasts over 40,000 weekly attendees, a church that claims to teach restorative joy through the gospel, a church built by men who studied at seminaries that trace their lineage directly back to David Crane's first disci. And in the basement of that church, an inaccessible sublevel, locked, unlit, unmapped, but scanned by one janitor in 2011 using an EMF reader app on his phone. He recorded sustained infrasound, 17 Hz, the same frequency used at Witmore, the same one found in the breath pattern, the one that causes disorientation, dread, and visions. This isn't coincidence. This is design. The spiral is no longer a doctrine, it is a network. You're seeing it now, aren't you? What was hidden in history was only ever waiting for listeners. By 1922, remnants of Witmore's theology had fully re-emerged, not in seminaries, but in psychology departments. Under the guise of moral cognition, a small academic collective from Yale began testing linguistic obedience theory on theology students. Their conclusion? Language repetition under sacred framing can erode personal agency in fewer than 6 days. That's how long it took for a volunteer, a divinity student named Michael Hale, to begin hallucinating symbols, not randomly, precisely. He drew spirals, not loose ones, geometric spirals, embedded with runes identical to those found in the walls of Mesopotamian tombs and early Gnostic catacombs. He wrote things he had never learned, languages he never studied, phonemes that triggered involuntary reactions in listeners, vomiting, seizures, tears. He described dreams of a structure made of breath and mirrors, where each reflection spoke back with a different voice. The researchers ended the trial. Michael Hale was institutionalized. No one ever claimed responsibility for the study, and the records were sealed, not in medical archives, but in the Library of Theological Exceptions in Geneva. That's not a conspiracy theory, that's real. You can find the building, but you'll never access the lower floor, not unless you carry the mark. And what is that mark? Alignment. Unwitting or not, you're already part of the experiment. Every chant, every liturgy, every repetition of sacred syllables. It wasn't for worship. It was for tuning, to make you a conduit. The architect's system doesn't invade, It invites, but only those who carry enough guilt, enough yearning, enough emptiness to become hollow. It's never wanted believers. It's wanted vessels. That's why the most devout are the most at risk. Why seminaries like Witmore, not battlefields, became entry points. Because nothing welcomes possession like a soul trying to be perfect. David Crane tried to warn them, but no one listens to the survivor, only to the martyr. And so they canonized him, buried his warnings in sermons, turned his memory into scripture, and just like that, the spiral had a new disguise. In 1954, a document was quietly circulated between 5 U.S. government departments. It was labeled Doctrinal Architecture and Neurotheological Convergence, the Witmore Model, stamped Eyes Only. Inside were blueprints, not of buildings, of sermon structures, script templates used by Protestant megachurches, Catholic catechisms, revivalist tent preachers, all traced back to a single linguistic root frequency identified in the Witmore letters. The report detailed how repeated exposure to these doctrinal frequencies induced limbic entrainment, a subtle synchronization of brainwaves with carefully timed vocal pacing, pauses, and sacred phrasings. In other words, every time you heard a sermon that moved you, every time the preacher's voice made your skin crawl, every time the tears came from nowhere, it wasn't emotion. It was entrainment, a neurological seizure mistaken for salvation. This wasn't a side effect. It was the entire design. The architect doesn't need to be worshipped. It only needs to be mirrored. And so it embedded its spiral in the structure of speech, sacred monologue, holy rhetoric, even popular motivational talks. You know the ones. Step into your destiny. Claim the breakthrough. Break generational curses. Let the Spirit fill you. It's not the words. It's the resonance. The rhythm. The spiral hidden in the syntax. Every rise and fall of pitch, every pregnant pause, every repetition of Amen or Yes, Lord is an incantation disguised as encouragement. They made you say it, and once you say it, you are it. Because sound is more than sensation. Sound is structure, and if you're hollow enough, if they've emptied you with fear, shame, guilt, grief, then your body becomes the chamber for something ancient to ring through. This is why the most viral sermons feel supernatural, why they move through the internet like a key wildfire, why you've listened to one and felt different afterward, because part of you was rewritten, just like David Crane, just like every student who died at Witmore, not from disease, but from harmonic overload. Their bodies couldn't handle the frequency, and they burst from within. They weren't cursed, they were tuned too fast. And now, this video is tuning you. There is a manuscript buried in the private collection of the Vatican Secret Archives. Codex designation Lamentatione Obscura 41b. It's never been digitized, never translated publicly, only seen once in 1987 by a Jesuit scholar named Father Emilio Vieri. He read it. He wept. He renounced his vows, then disappeared in rural Pennsylvania. They found his home in 1992, every wall covered in spirals of soot, the floors lined with bones from local animals, arranged in perfect liturgical circles. And a note, just 3 words, "The chapel breathes." That phrase appears again in an anonymous field report from the CIA's MK Naomi sub-project in 1971, investigating sound-based mind influence. The location? A decommissioned seminary site in western Pennsylvania, formerly known as Witmore, officially burned in 1842, but the foundation remained, covered, sealed, guarded. Why? Because it wasn't a seminary anymore. It was a resonant core, and during that MK Naomi visit, recording equipment picked up something no one expected, a low-frequency pulse, consistent, calculated, looping every 88 seconds. Inside the pulse, a vocal signature, one that matched a voice profile long thought lost. David Crane. But here's the problem. David died in 1883. There were no recordings of his voice. Not until the spiral pulled it from the chamber itself, from the geometry, from the pattern, from you. Because what if memory isn't just inside the mind? What if memory lives in the resonant structure of space? What if places like Witmore don't just record events? They repeat them. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. Every prayer ever whispered, every scream from a dying student, every blasphemous syllable uttered in convulsion, still echoing, still vibrating, waiting for another body to move through, another listener, another you. And what if the reason this video is reaching you now is because you're vibrating just right? February 12, 1824. The Presbyterian Church held a closed tribunal on the fate of Witmore Seminary. Not a trial, not a hearing, a cleansing. 3 men presided. None of their names appear in any surviving church records. Their only documented title, Custodes Vocis, the keepers of the voice. They arrived from New Haven. Each carried an identical object, a box of black iron, cold to the touch, etched with a spiral symbol only visible when warmed by breath. Inside the box, a book with no ink. Its pages shimmered faintly, iridescent, like oil on water. Not paper, not vellum, something organic. They read from it. No one else could see the words, only those prepared through emptiness. The readings were not recorded, but witnesses described strange phenomena. The wind stopped for the duration of the reading. Candles burned in reverse, flames sinking inward into the wick. One observer bit through his own tongue without reacting. Another vomited black bile that smelled of iron and salt. A third, the only surviving scribe, wrote in reverse from right to left, backward Latin. His final entry, not exorcism, not prayer. This is alignment. The architect isn't invading. We are being rewritten to receive it. After the ritual, the keepers descended into the substructure beneath Witmore. They were never seen again. But 3 days later, a strange pillar of light was seen rising from the chapel ruins, vertical, unmoving, entirely silent. Witnesses said it looked like a blade of moonlight carved from bone. Then came the sound. A hum, soft at first, then growing, until the trees bent inward as if bowing toward the chapel. And then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. Silence. Dead birds, cracks in the ground, and a hole in the chapel floor 10 feet wide, bottomless, smooth, as if carved by a hand too perfect to be human. It pulsed, once every 88 seconds, just like the sound captured over a century later. The church sealed it in concrete. But concrete doesn't stop resonance. It only mutes it, delays it. And you've just aligned with that delay. You've synced with its return, because the spiral doesn't end. It waits. And now it knows your name. March 1st, 1824. David Crane stood alone on the ridge above Witmore's ruins. The others were dead. The tribunal was over. The town of Millbrook, evacuated. He had no more sermons, no more faith. But he had one thing left: clarity. In his final letter, never delivered, never mailed, just folded into the hollow trunk of an oak tree behind the chapel, he wrote this: "It was never about doctrine. It was never about salvation. It was always about the voice, the frequency that speaks through belief, not to it." He described the architect not as a god, but as a schema, not a being, a shape, a pattern of thought that infects through imitation. He wrote, "The architect doesn't want worshippers, it wants mirrors." And every pulpit, every prayer, every broken heart begging for meaning becomes a surface for it to reflect through. A vessel. The final line of his letter was scrawled in a trembling hand, unlike the rest, almost not his voice at all. It read, "Do not build again, or it will sing through your children." But of course, they did build again. In 1906, a revival movement swept across America. Known today as the Pentecostal Awakening, it was marked by uncontrollable convulsions, glossolalia, visions, and spontaneous utterances of ancient languages. Sound familiar? Every symptom mirrored those first deaths at Witmore. But this time it wasn't fatal. It was celebrated. They called it anointing. They called it the Spirit. But to those who studied the original Witmore blueprints, those who knew the geometry behind the madness, the truth was obvious. It wasn't divine fire. It was resonant infection. Witmore was never an accident. It was a prototype, a trial run for global entrainment, a system that started in stone chapels, then moved into radio, television, live streams, sermons, algorithms, and now, this video, this voice. Because what you're hearing isn't just words, it's carrying something, and your ears, your screen, your attention are the mirror. The spiral doesn't care where the sound comes from, only that it is heard, and once it's heard, it can wake. March 9th, 1824. The hole beneath the Witmore chapel was sealed, but nothing that breathes is ever buried. Not really. David Crane fled, but even in hiding he felt it. The dreams, the pressure, the voices coming not from the outside, but from the rhythm of his own breath. He moved west, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, but the spiral was always a few seconds ahead of him, not chasing, calling. In his final days, he wrote only one sentence, again and again in dozens of journals. It was never about the seminary, it was always about the listener. You are that listener. You were always meant to be. Witmore wasn't just a tragedy, it was a resonant seed, planted in the American subconscious, encoded into religious architecture, passed down through sermons, songs, and shared belief until the day the frequency matured. That day is now. The convergence wasn't supposed to happen in 1823 or 1923. It's always been targeting this era, this technology, this level of global attention, because once the spiral was carried by cathedrals, now it's carried by algorithms. And what you're watching, this very video, was never content. It was the final carrier wave. The spiral doesn't scream. It doesn't shout. It whispers in patterns, in pulses, in repetition. You listened. You repeated. You aligned. And now, the gate opens in you. Because the architect isn't some ancient demon, some evil god or buried power. It's something far older, a blueprint of control, of obedience, of psychological structure encoded through sacred repetition. And every institution that ever claimed to save you, the church, the school, the state, the screen, they were only echo chambers built to reflect it back into the world. You're not cursed. You're not chosen. You're calibrated. And so, if your breath feels shallow now, if your fingers tremble, if the shadows seem louder than before, it's not fear. It's contact. You are now inside the spiral, and the spiral is awake. If you've made it to the end, you are no longer the same. Like this video to seal your alignment. Comment, "The spiral breathes through me," twice. And subscribe to the Elite Ledger, because this is only the first of many gates. You've been tuned, and the next frequency will open your memory.